If you suspect that your spouse is hiding assets, then good for you, because that means that you are more in tune than a lot of people.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life.
This week, we had Kimberly Nelson on the show, and we had a great conversation about alimony, understanding what you have, and we share some strategies to safeguard your own assets during divorce. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Kimberly Nelson is joining us. Kimberly is a financial advisor at Coastal Bridge Advisors in Santa Monica, California. Kimberly is also a certified divorce financial analyst and is passionate about uncomplicating it for her clients. Today, Kimberly and I will be discussing the different types of alimony, tips on negotiating fair alimony, identifying hidden assets, and modifying payments after divorce, and how changes in laws and economic conditions affect alimony decisions and long-term financial security. Welcome to the show, Kimberly.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm really excited to be here, really excited to have this conversation with you. And this is definitely a topic that I am passionate about here in the state of California and Florida alike. There's just a lot going on in both of these states. So I think that this is super timely.
Awesome. Yes, I agree. And one of my favorite topics as well. So, but Kimberly, for our listeners, I'd love it if you could share a little bit about, how you got to where you are professionally and what you are currently doing, for your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I began my career in 2004, so 20 years ago now. And I began as a financial advisor at one of the big banks here in town and did that training program. Joined a team right out of that, and that is still the team that I'm with today. So we were at the big banks for many years, spun out and went independent about 8 years ago, and it's been a terrific move, not only for us, but for our clients to be independent. I've got a finance degree from the University of Colorado, had a great time there, and earned the CFA charter holder designation when I was in my 20s as well. And then really got interested in the divorce space about 10 years ago when I watched a couple of our clients go through an ultra high net worth divorce. And I just saw the balance of power and how it was a little bit out of whack. And I really became an advocate for women in this space from that time forward. So became a chartered divorce financial analyst at that time, and the space that I work in primarily today.
Well, great. Now, for where, in California, I guess there is still alimony or spousal support. And what is the current state of alimony in California when you're helping your clients?
Yeah.
What are you guys looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know that it's that different from state to state. I think that this translates really well to Florida also. But, alimony is synonymous with maintenance or spousal support. It is not the same as child support. So we can't confuse those two things. And it's based on many different factors: ability to pay, marital standard of living, all sorts of different things. And so I would say the biggest consideration with alimony today is length of time that you'll be obligated to pay and how we choose to pay that, whether it's in a lump sum upfront negotiated as part of the settlement, or if it is in ongoing monthly payments for some specified period of time. And there are some advantages and some risks with both of those.
Yes, absolutely. And we certainly have different types of alimony here in Florida. And a lot of it has to do same with the length of the marriage in conjunction with the need and ability to pay. We recently enacted the legislator formula. So it's a little bit different now in Florida, which can, provide for some predictability, but it sounds like they're really pretty similar still in theory as California. Now, when working with your clients, let's talk a little bit about, the different ways that they can handle, alimony, and what are some of the evaluations you do to help them figure out, hey, what would be best? What would be most appropriate for you, as far as a lump sum versus monthly payment?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And I think that, one of those two things will emerge as being the preferred method of handling it as you go through the divorce. And, from a financial perspective, the lump sum option could be a little bit difficult if there are not significant assets to cover that up front. We don't want to leave one spouse with zero liquidity, for example. So, for an ultra high net worth couple with significant liquid assets, the lump sum payment might be easier for a variety of reasons. There's no monthly check that has to be written. You don't lose the alimony if you remarry, if you are the recipient there. That's a big one. There's also no risk of the ex-spouse's situation changing significantly and having those payments reduced. You can seek a modification in almost any case if there's a material change in circumstance, of course. And I'm no attorney. I don't even play one on TV, but I've learned a little bit about this just from talking to these attorneys and such about how all of this works. So, you really do remove a lot of the uncertainty from the table if you accept the lump sum payment, and then you are able to move on with your life as well. If you want to remarry, you can do so without concern of losing your monthly check. And I think there's also something, Heather, something psychological about waiting for that check in the mail every month. It's almost like feeling like you're a child sitting around waiting for the weekly allowance, from your parents. There's kind of a dynamic there that I personally wouldn't want to be a part of. And I think that both spouses can psychologically feel like they've moved on when they're not having to have that arrangement with each other anymore.
I agree with you. Right. It's just that it's still ongoing, and it's also, you're still dependent on that, generally speaking, for most, we represent women, but for most women, if they're on the receiving end of that. Now, in particularly in California, are there any different special tax implications on either of those options, at least like from the state level?
Well, so yeah, absolutely. So first of all, the lump sum alimony, if that's negotiated during the divorce, then there really isn't any taxation per se on that. We negotiate it, and it's not taxable really to the recipient or a tax benefit to the payer. So that's worked in. We had a big change recently in 2019 that you're probably aware of, Heather, but it was with the IRS, and prior to that, there was a tax benefit to the payer, and the income was taxable to the recipient. So you had to declare this on your tax return every single year. And so payments, of course, were higher, commensurate with that rule. In 2019, they walked that back, and anybody who divorced post 2019, you're no longer subject to taxation. So there wasn't any real change in the amounts that people were receiving on an after-tax basis. All the payments adjusted essentially for that, right? If you are under the old arrangements, then your amount did not change. You are still declaring that on your taxes. You're grandfathered in under the former rule. So that was a really big change. Child support, just to throw that into the mix for anybody who's wondering, child support is never taxable to the recipient and never a tax deduction to the payer. So effectively, alimony is now on that same schedule, whereas it was not prior to 2019.
And, what are some of the things that you do, in your position as an analyst and, specifically with the, the divorce financial analyst, how do you help your client and their attorneys, I'm sure many times, really look at what amount of alimony they are going to need?
So the operative word, what you just said there, Heather, I love it. You said what they'll need. Okay. And so what they'll need and what is fair might be two different amounts, right? Might be two different things. And I like to tell my clients that what's fair is what they're going to work out with their attorney in the settlement or at trial. What's going to be enough is what they're going to work out with me. So how do I figure out what's enough for them? We do a lot of planning up front during this process, and that includes seeing what what the marital standard of living is, what it costs to run that household, what it's going to cost once we've split these households, right? Because typically the sum of the parts is actually greater than the whole in this case. It costs more to run two households than it does one by more than half, right? You know, so it's a lot more expensive to run two than it is just to run one. So we have to look at this very carefully and see what we're going to need when all is said and done. And need is taken into consideration here by the court. Ability to pay is a big one, you know, and marital standard of living, of course. So what do? I take our clients or our potential clients through a planning process where we take all of the assets that we believe they'll reasonably be able to expect post-divorce, and we will run many different iterations to figure out how much we can be spending and what goals are achievable with these assets. If we have goals that might be a little bit beyond our expectations here, then we'll have a reconciliation discussion about that and see where we can maybe cut spending a little bit or modify those goals to make them a little bit more achievable. So, you know, interest rates are a big thing. The economy fluctuating is a big thing. And external financial conditions are also a big thing. When interest rates are low, for example, a lump sum payment could be appealing to the payer because as the value of money in present terms is higher, the opportunity cost of not investing that money elsewhere to grow on their behalf is lower. So conversely, in a high rate environment, a lump sum may seem a little less attractive to the payer and more attractive to the recipient because of the better returns on investment. So it's hard to tell which way interest rates are moving, even for economists that just study these charts all day long. So we don't base our decision completely on that, but it's certainly taken into account. So really, it's all about the needs and desires of the recipient, you know, of my client, and then also what economic forecasts we can possibly make. But, you know, I would love to ask you, Heather, how you go about determining what's fair for your clients. I know DISA is a big part of it, but for anybody who's wondering, you know, gosh, I know what I need, but what can I reasonably expect out of my ex? You know, how do you start that conversation?
You know, it's a challenging one often. And even if, you know, for our listeners, like, right, you said, okay, we've got the same money coming in and now two different households. So that tends to be the case. And it is a question of need. And that's where we basically do their budget. It's called a financial affidavit, and really look at that. And, you know, it also is, I start with need because, of course, shocking to you and our listeners, it seems as though husbands always are like, well, lower their ability to pay come a divorce. But, you know, we start with, hey, what's the need and what's based on, you know, what you have been doing, because there is an, you know, we do look at, like, just because you're getting divorced doesn't mean, let's say, you know, if you had always taken a family vacation, and maybe it may not be as expensive, but you have a right to incorporate that into your overall annual budget and then work that back. So that is that conversation that, you know, we start with. And then we have to, at the end of the day, it's always like, well, when we get their discovery, then we have to have, you know, a real discussion, what money is available, because I mean, that's the key. Okay, well, what does he have coming in? And, you know, what are your needs? Now, something we also have to do where we rely on professionals like you, Kimberly, and I'd love for you to explain this if you've had these situations. So if there's, and this will be typical, you know, in couples who are divorcing and they have acquired assets, they've built assets and investment assets that, you know, we will split, that is separate from alimony. That's not what you're required to live off of. However, the law in Florida is that those assets, you do have to look at a reasonable rate of return on that investment. And unfortunately, rather than reinvest it into the investment, you have to incorporate that into the income, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm for our listeners, I'm trying to make it easy, but basically you've got stocks and investment. It's going to produce a percentage theoretically. We have to look at that as that whole big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have bet you do too. And, especially it's harder sometimes because the point of those investments is to obviously let it continue to grow and not have to live off some of that. But we have to look at that in some instances.
Absolutely, because all of that technically is available for support for both the recipient and the payer, right? And what you bring up is a really great point. Alimony is separate from the division of assets. There's going to be an equitable division of assets, and then alimony is what comes on top of that from one party to the other. If one party, and again, typically in an ultra high net worth situation, which is a space that I play in, and I think probably most of your clients as well, Heather, what typically happens is that there's one earner and then the other spouse is at home, because when one spouse earns such a large salary, the couple is not served by the other one working. The couple is more served by that person being at home, being available to go on vacation when the earning spouse has their time and whatnot. And so typically one is earning and one is not. And so we have a really big gap then. We can split the assets, and let's just say that it's 50-50. It's in a long-term marriage, and we aim for equitable division or equal division, depending on what state you're in. Community property is divided 50-50, but then there needs to be something from the moneyed spouse or the earning spouse over to the non-moneyed spouse to help support them again in their marital standard of living, either through a reasonable time period such that they can become self-supporting, or if the marriage has been a very, very long duration, then it might be a lifetime support order, and so, it's really important to see what's coming in from the assets that the client is entitled to, number one, from the alimony that they're probably going to wind up with, number two, and then 3 and 4, if there's any child support that's going to be coming in, we take that into consideration. And then number 4, is the non-moneyed spouse going to go out and have a career again? Are they going to go and be working and whatnot? And that's something too that could cause a modification to be sought. If we've got a non-moneyed spouse who hasn't been working for 15 years, but suddenly they go back to work and maybe they get a master's degree and now they're earning a really nice living, the paying spouse may in that case request a modification and say, hey, in order for that marital standard of living to be kept, she doesn't require as much from me now because she's earning quite a bit. And I insert he and she, just randomly here. We have a lot of spousal situations now where she is the earner and he is the one that's at home. That does happen. Even in 2024, for some reason, typically what I see is that he is out earning and she's been the one at home, but more and more it's flipping. And I love that. I love that women are out there doing this and achieving their goals as well. But, regardless of what the situation has been, if she's been at home with the kids or whatnot, she's still entitled to that marital standard of living, at least for a period of time. There's a lot of discussion in California about this magical 10 years of marriage. They say that as long as you've been married for 10 years, you're entitled to a whole lot more than if you were married for 9. Sort of true, sort of not true. And I'm going to ask you how it works in California or in Florida, Heather. But in California, a 10-year marriage just means that the court retains jurisdiction, and it's more likely that you're going to get more lengthy support. Whereas if you've been married for under 10 years, kind of seems like the standard is half the duration of the marriage is what you'll have support for. But there's so many other factors that go into it, whether there's children, what the marital standard was, ability to pay, need, all sorts of things. But how is that in Florida, Heather, with a lengthy marriage versus a shorter marriage?
Yes, when you have a long-term marriage over 20 years, it's presumed that there's going to be, we used to have permanent alimony, that has been abolished. And so now it's called durational. However, there still are, the but if this exists types of situations. So there can be conditions, there can be instances where the alimony could go longer. And that's, important because it was very, I want to say the alimony changes and proposed for the reform had been, on on the lobbyist and everyone moving for years and years, almost 10 years. So it was a long time coming, but, yes, we look at the duration of the marriage. It's very unlikely that if you have a shorter term marriage, that there will be alimony in play. But again, favorite lawyer's answer, it does depend, because there can be extenuating circumstances that the law supports that there might still be alimony. So that's one of the things that, obviously we always advise our listeners, you have to talk to an attorney and get an understanding, one, based on the state you live in and the laws and your financial situation, because not everybody's the same, even though they try to change the law so that it is more predictable. There's just a lot unknowns, and it's so very fact specific as far as what the financial picture is. And one of those things when we talked about the equitable distribution and that it that does affect your income, and it's easier for people to understand. I mentioned earlier, when you have investment income, because that's hard to predict, right? I mean, I don't know if you can comfortably say, well, we'll just imagine, we'll just assume you're going to get 4%, off of your investments that you can count on a monthly basis. But sometimes real estate helps people understand, if you have rental property and if you're going to receive that property, they're going to count that if the rent is, income and not, whatever that net number is, they're going to count that. And that's an important thing, I think, for people to understand, because sometimes it may be such that there are so many assets that do produce income that it can sufficiently cover one's need. And then the alimony really may or may not exist if the amount of income, and that could be, you get more of those income producing assets for that purpose, right? You may negotiate that. That's not something necessarily the court would do, but, can be negotiated, because it's important to understand, hey, what, the income may produce off that. And that is always going to be considered an alimony.
Yeah. And I'd say that that's a big part of what I do help attorneys with too, Heather, is how are these assets, behaving? What's the cost basis? What can we expect from these assets? And there's so many different kinds of asset classes out there these days that it can be a little challenging to work through all that without a financial advisor. So as you're negotiating the settlement, for your clients, I'll often step in and help for you to make the case for what your client should have and why we would want this versus that, or just help everyone understand what we're leaving on the table if we do negotiate and settle and walk away from something. It's okay to do that. It's okay to walk away, but you have to know what you're walking away from. It's got to be an eyes wide open thing. And all assets are not created equal. Retirement assets are not the same as assets inside of a taxable brokerage account. Which one's better? Well, they're just different. One's not better than the other. We want to make sure that we have enough retirement assets, right? Because that's a special vehicle where you have preferential tax treatment, at least until you start pulling that money out when you're in your 70s, when you have to. But at the same time, the taxable assets in a traditional brokerage account, they're available to you now with no penalty and no taxation. So we need to have a sufficient amount of both. We can't have all of one and none of the other. So that becomes quite a conversation when we are talking about, buying one spouse out of the home, for example. What are we giving up in order to take that house? And what's the tax basis of that home versus the tax basis of what we're handing over? Because once the whole thing's said and done, the ink is dry and all the assets have been divided, we don't want to have a whole bunch of assets on our side with an incredibly low cost basis, meaning they have a very, very large embedded gain. Because then if we decide that we want to do something different with those assets, we're going to be on the hook solely with a really large tax bill, and so we have to take those things into consideration as we're dividing things and negotiating. And I would say, just to guess, Heather, I'm going to guess 95% of your cases probably are settled versus going to court, over these things. I'm just going to guess.
Yes, we do have a high rate of things that are settled. Usually, the more litigated cases nowadays, it used to be, we had a lot of alimony cases just because people don't want to hear what they don't want to hear and they're not going to agree to permanent
Mm-hmm.
alimony. But I had many trials back in the day where that we went to trial on those issues, and and that's the purposes of the court for people who can't agree. But we do have mandatory mediation, so it doesn't mean you are required to settle, but you are required to attend mediation in all
Mm-hmm.
divorce cases and even post-divorce cases, which is helpful. And yes, settling, coming up with an agreement really allows for the parties to have some creativity. It's a great opportunity for the financial advisors and analysts to really weigh in. Hey, this is how this will be treated and how this can benefit you, as a client. And there are certainly times where that financial analyst will be involved in mediation because it helps the client understand, just exactly what you said. You must understand the tax consequences of certain assets, because boy, that's a tough pill to swallow later. And it's, if you didn't seek to find that out, because you
Mm-hmm.
didn't really know what you're getting into, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the taxes are a big thing, even if you're not paying on the alimony. But if you have big capital gains and things where it limits, like you said, what can be done with, particular assets and stuff. And for our listeners, that's just the importance of having a team of, professionals on the divorce to help you understand, not only educate yourself, but then also, when we do go in front of a judge, Kimberly, it's so important. Someone's got to tell the judge, well, this is like,
Mm-hmm.
you see this as the asset worth, but whoever gets this is also going to have these consequences, because the court can certainly consider that, but it's not something usually our clients, or even the other client really truly knows. So it's, that's another time when we really do need experts, because the court needs to understand what those implications are, which was a long way
Right.
off from why do you settle. But yes, we settle a lot because
Mm-hmm.
it's so much better to have a part in your divorce agreement, right? And come to terms with
Absolutely.
that. And then knowing, like, I mean, lump sum, I think everybody would sign off on that, but it's just not always there, right? There's not always that
Right.
availability of liquid funds that,
Right.
makes sense, but it's an option. And it's very rare here in Florida that you will be awarded a lump sum, as in for, say, to go for a payment. You can agree to it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very
Mm-hmm.
unlikely that you're going to get that in front of a judge, which is, always things we talk about with clients. So, where there's, you have creativity to when settling in a case.
Yeah, and that makes sense because it would be hard, I would imagine, for a judge to simply order a very large lump sum payment out of somebody. So
Yeah.
I can see how that would probably be the case. That if you go in front of a judge, lump sum is a very unlikely outcome for you, And again, it's kind of my favorite outcome, if you will, only because I typically work with the out spouse, the out of the loop spouse is what I like to say. Out spouse sounds like a terrible term, but really out of the loop, because when we have the moneyed spouse, he generally will inherit the network, right? The CPA is working for him, the attorneys are working for him, the
Yes.
financial advisor is working for him. She needs a whole new team around her, to help her understand how all of this stuff works. And I feel like the biggest case to be made for lump sum is it's emotional, it's not financial, it's the ability to move on with your life if you want to. Because I actually think that divorce and the arrangement that you make is reconciling the past. It should not have any bearing on your future. And so if you can reconcile the past, I don't think that you should not be able to remarry because you're in fear of losing your income stream. I actually know, I know somebody who is receiving a pretty big payout every single month. They didn't get a lump sum. They've got a $30,000 a month payment that they're receiving. And they've been in a relationship for a very long time with a new partner, but they can't live together or anything like that because even cohabitating will cause that monthly payment to go away. If you can prove, I mean, there's a set of standards, and it varies a little bit state to state, but the set of standards is roughly, if you're living with someone and they're contributing to at least half of the living costs, that is effectively a remarriage. And you can petition to have your support canceled if you're the payer, if they are living with somebody else. And so you really, you're not able to go and do what you want to do with your life when you still have that going on, when that's happening. And so, the issue of alimony, it's so huge in a financial planning space, really, with what we do. The purpose is just such that the non-moneyed spouse can continue to receive the financial benefits of the marriage that they contributed to for many years of their life, and, maintaining the marital standard of living, providing time for adjustment post-divorce to the new financial realities, maybe seeking new employment, education, et cetera, like we've talked about. And I think that just understanding the incoming alimony is critical to understanding what you can spend every month in order to achieve all of your goals and not run out of money. And I think that not running out of money for the non-moneyed spouse especially, but for both, it's really critical to the success of this new family, right? It is not good for him if the mother of his children does not have money. That is not good for him, And so I think that the more that we can do now at this stage to educate and prevent any crises, it's just better off for everybody, because once this divorce is final, we've got a new family here. We're creating something new. Assuming there's children present, that ex-spouse is going to be a part of your life for the rest of your life, because you're going to be attending graduations, weddings, you're going to be sharing grandchildren, all of that. And with both parties feeling emotionally healthy and well, that is what's going to allow that situation to move forward positively. So, as tough and challenging emotionally as the divorce can be, and just as taxing on everybody, once we're done, and I love what you said earlier, Heather, about really taking control of your situation when you settle versus going in front of a judge. There is something really emotional about feeling like you were in charge of your outcome versus a stranger that you don't know slamming a gavel down and making huge decisions on behalf of your family that you now just have to live with. I think there's something really emotional and really powerful about feeling like you are the one that made the choice. Even if you're only 60 or 70% happy and not 100, just the fact that you take ownership of it and it was part yours, I think it is easier to move on after that situation than having to go to trial.
It is. I think so. And for most people, they, it just provides closure and it's done versus years in court. Now, I do have a question for you because, what are you able to do? I would imagine you've heard this before. I know I've heard it several times there, when I have a client come in and she's certain that her husband has hidden assets. And they really are so concerned because they are the out spouse. Like you said, they don't really know what's going on. But she's like, I really feel like he's been planning this for some time and there are hidden assets. Like what can you do? What can you do to help them?
There's a lot to be said on that topic, Heather. That would be a whole nother podcast in and of itself. But for the purposes of this one, I'll tell you that, first of all, if you suspect that your spouse is hiding assets, then good for you, because that means that you are more in tune than a lot of people. So if you suspect they're hiding assets, you need to definitely let your attorney know. And number two, we need to look at that tax return. The tax return is going to tell us a lot of stuff that your ex-spouse will not tell you, okay? If there are assets that are generating income or that have created a capital gain or anything like that, it's going to appear on the tax return somewhere. So we need to first look at that tax return. And when we're constructing marital balance sheets, whenever I assist attorneys in that endeavor, I do not do it without the tax return because, the marital balance sheet starts with, I know we have this here, I know we have that there. it starts there, but the tax return is going to pick up anything that anybody forgot. And it could be that everyone comes in with the best of intentions and they just forget about an asset. I mean, let's be real. Ultra high net worth people have a lot of stuff going on in a lot of different places. Someone could legitimately just forget something. And we want to not forget, because whatever we're splitting needs to be codified in writing. So looking at the tax return helps us understand significantly what a couple has. And also we're going to look for inconsistencies. Is the tax owed a lot greater than what we think it should be based on these assets? Are his separate assets somehow flowing through to that joint return? I saw a case not too long ago where we had very little income for the couple, but there was a several $100,000 tax bill that just made no sense whatsoever. And it turns out that his separate assets somehow were flowing onto the joint tax return. And that, of course, muddies the characterization. And we've got some great cases to be made for why either those assets are not actually separate, number one, or the income they're kicking off better be considered separate, or a community, if the community is going to be paying the tax on it. So, we have some arguments that can be made there. And, anything you think your spouse is hiding, go ahead and write it down, just make sure, and then we can look into it. We can ask about it during the settlement. We can subpoena records on that if there's any proof whatsoever that it existed. If you're looking at a tax return where your spouse makes $750,000 a year, but you're only seeing $10,000 a month coming into the joint account, there's something wrong. So that's another popular one. So just checking and seeing what's reasonable. And if you think something's unreasonable or question it at all, pull in a professional and they will help you understand if that's reasonable or unreasonable. But hiding assets, Heather, is a great one. I would say it happens in almost every single divorce case that I deal with, whether it was inadvertent or otherwise. It happens. It's a big thing. So, yeah.
Well, and I appreciate. So if, let's say, one of our listeners, she's thinking about divorce, but she's not sure she's readiness now, but she's like, oh, he's definitely hiding stuff. What would you tell them to do as a start, even though they're not in a divorce right now, but like to plan and to get themselves in a better situation for when they are ready?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I think that the most important thing there is to start educating yourself on what you have and where things are. Okay, so you're not sure if you're going to stay or you're going to go. That's fine. Okay. There's things going on with the marriage that maybe will make it such that you can work through it or not. Hopefully the money part of it is not the forefront of that decision. But I'll tell you, Heather, what I've kind of found is that if money is the number one cause of divorce, and arguably so, I think it is definitely the number one reason that people stay in relationships they don't want to be in. It's definitely money.
Agreed.
And so if you want to prepare yourself for making a decision that's not based on money and based on what you just want to do with your life and how you want to live it, then you need to educate yourself about the money. So the next time you sit down with your CPA to sign your tax return, don't just sign the darn return that they put in front of you. Make the CPA review it with you, the assets that are generating the income that you owe the tax on, the earned income, the capital gains and losses. All of that will help you understand what you own. Okay. You can do that with your spouse present or not, but I would not just sign your next tax return because someone puts it in front of you. I would have them go through it because that's going to help you understand what you own. Number two, do you have access to all the financial accounts? Do you have your own login? You should, okay? With our clients, all of our married clients have their own logins. We don't make couples share logins. We don't do that.
Right.
Have your own. There's no institution out there that's going to force a married couple to share a login for their joint account. So make sure that you're able to log in on your own and that you can print statements if you need to. Actually read the mail that comes to you. Don't open up mail that doesn't have your name on it. Okay, even for married couples in most states, it's mail fraud to open up mail that does not have your name on it. Okay, so I don't recommend that. But read the mail, see what's coming in the mail, and make sure you understand what it is. And if you don't, you can certainly ask your spouse, or you can call the number on the letter and learn more that way. Understanding what it costs to run your household also. If you are the out spouse, you're not the one that's working, the out of the loop spouse. Once again, that's all that means, out of the loop. If you're feeling a little out of the loop, try to figure out and quantify what it costs to run your household. What is your mortgage every month? What is your property tax that you owe once a year? What do you really spend at the grocery store? For anybody who needs a tool to help them do this, I have a wonderful conscious spending plan tool, okay, where you can actually go through. It's got a lot of categories on it, and you can really get your arms around what you're spending, because you are going to need to know that if you are going to be planning for a separate life. So all of these things, doing all these things, not only do you feel like you're taking control, and psychologically that's very, very powerful, but knowledge in itself is power. So you need to know all of these things if you are going to move on strong and confident. Okay. So again, I've got tools and resources for all these things. If you are thinking about what you need to do, and you're worried about leaving your spouse because you're worried about all these things, well, let's eliminate that fear. Okay. If you want to leave your spouse, I want it to be for some other, for the reason, because it's not working between the two of you emotionally, and the relationship's no longer serving you. I wouldn't want anyone staying because they feel like they have no other choice. That should not be. So
what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of alimony and divorce settlements?
That's a really good question. The most misunderstood. I think it definitely has to do with just not understanding how the assets you own function and provide you with income and benefit and value. I think there's a lot of mystery around that for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And, understanding how those assets can work for you post-divorce, what they are. I think that's probably it. Most of us, when we're going through a divorce, it's our first time. And it may be something we only do once and we never come back and do. It's really hard to be super educated about something that we never have done before in our lives, and hope we never do.
And hope to never do again, right? Yeah.
Hope to never do again, exactly. So, I think that, we're all going into it a little bit cold, right? We've never done it. And each divorce is very, very different. Each couple is different. Each set of assets are different. Each state is different. So depending on who you are, where you are, and what you own, it can be so different. And so, I think that that's probably the most common, I'm going to just say, misunderstood maybe isn't quite the right word, but I would say the thing that we just don't calculate when we're thinking about this process. It's the thing that isn't really at the forefront of our minds, and we kind of stumble through it. And this is why the team of professionals is so important, because Heather, you've done divorce a million times, okay? Not your own, but you've done divorce a million times. And so, your clients are going to benefit from, a lot of synergies that are going to come from working with you, because you have seen things for the 18th, 21st, 85th, and 160th time. For them, it might be the first. And also, when it's not your divorce, you're not emotional about it. You're emotional about your own money. You're emotional about your own personal situations. But when it's somebody else, I think you're able to see the forest for the trees. You're able to see the big picture when they can't. And
absolutely, which is what really, why we certainly advocate for our clients to have a team, because then you have, professionals on your side who have objectivity. But I can't believe we are almost out of time. But Kimberly, before we go, can you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience through your career and experience?
Absolutely. What I've found is that education and transparency is critical to combating fear. That's the only thing. This is such a scary time in someone's life. And the only way we can fight fear is with education. So knowledge creates that empowerment, helping women understand how their assets function for them and what their assets can provide in terms of a lifestyle, and how they can move forward confidently is the antidote to that fear. And really what I've found too is that when you set the boundaries for someone, meaning we come up with a conscious spending plan, we understand why we can only spend X per month and not double X. It's amazing how I find that these women really can stick to the conscious spending plan and to the financial plan as a whole. The problem that people have in sticking with the plan is that there isn't a plan, or no one has told them. So I can tell you that the resiliency that I've witnessed has been astounding. And there is life after this. There's a great life after this. And, you know, what you have created up until this point is still with you. Okay. So he may not be, or if it's a same sex couple, maybe, you know, she may not be with you, or whatever the situation may be, but there is something greater out there for you. And when you make the space for that other thing, it's amazing how it does come to you, and life can be better than it ever was before. And so the resiliency that I've seen is incredible and amazing. And you have to push through those feelings. Don't be afraid to feel them. But again, removing as much uncertainty from the table as you possibly can by working with professionals that know the situation and can help you get to that next step is critical.
Thank you so much. And lastly, Kimberly, where can our listeners find you for more information and resources?
You bet. My firm, Coastal Bridge Advisors, our website is www.coastalbridgeadvisors.com. My contact information is on there, and my email address is there as well, but I will give it to everybody here. It's K Nelson, my first initial, my last name, K Nelson, at Coastal Bridge Advisors, just like it sounds. Advisors is ORS at the end there, .com. And would love to hear from you. Would love to hear what you thought about the podcast. And I have to take a moment and just thank you, Heather, for the wonderful work that you do advocating for women. And in the great state of Florida, there's a lot going on down there. And, you know, I really appreciate what you do for these women as well. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. We really appreciate your time today, and it's been a great discussion. But we have reached the end of our show, and we so appreciate Kimberly for joining us to discuss alimony and understanding really what you have. And listeners, if you or someone you know is going through divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at floridawomensLawGroup.com. You'll find our practice areas and a link to our website in the show notes, as well as the links to find Kimberly's site and email. Thank you all for listening.